Segundo City Council and Planning Commission, take two, Monday, June 14th, 2021 at 4 p.m. We're calling this meeting to order, and Commissioner Newman was on bright and early, so that'd be great.
Yes, thank you. Please stand and place our hands on our heart. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Commissioner Newman. All right, now is the time and place for public communications. I think we have at least one person that would like to speak on Zoom. Is that right?
So this is Mona. Currently, right now, there are several people that are in attendance, but none of the hands are raised. So if you could raise your hand if you choose to speak.
Well, while we're waiting on that, let's give, Tracy, do you have the emails that you could read while we're waiting? Give people an opportunity to raise their hand and speak.
Absolutely. I'll go ahead. My name is Anya Goldstein. I'm an El Segundo homeowner and taxpayer. Council members, please use your office to ensure that El Segundo has affordable housing options for all, including properties available for purchase. Not only will the families and individuals living in affordable housing properties benefit, but so too will our city at large through increased economic development. Studies show that affordable housing leads to greater tax generation, the creation of more jobs, and an increase in job retention and productivity. These are just a few of the reasons why we should be focused on creating affordable housing opportunities in El Segundo. Thank you, Anya Goldstein. My name is David Hollop, and I am an El Segundo resident. I am writing today in support of building quality, affordable housing and for shifting our community's view on this entire endeavor so that it's truly seen as the community benefit. It can be, not as an obligation forced upon the city. I was extremely disheartened to see the term maintaining the existing character included as one of the concerns in the survey, and thereby biasing the results, which is well-known long used coded language employed by those who use any plan to build more housing as a perceived threat, often with racial and class-based undertones. We all know California is facing a severe housing crisis, and to successfully address it, as well as the environmental, equity, and economic crisis around us, we must not repeat the same mistakes of the past that have brought us to this point. And my final one, my name is Charlie. I live in El Segundo and attended ESHS. I want to express my support for affordable housing in our city. Affordable housing helps the health, financial stability, security, and diversity of communities, and it helps such public servants as teachers and first responders. I know of at least 2 teachers at my school who live at the poverty line. They are among the kindest, the hardest working, and most dedicated people I know. Yet one must work a second job to make ends meet. El Segundo is a city dedicated to its schools, and it is an injustice that this situation is allowed to exist. Affordable housing is one of the ways we can assist our teachers. They do too much for me and my peers for our community to let this travesty stand, and the council has the power to help. Thank you, Charlie Henry. And that's all I have.
Thank you. I see at least one hand up.
Yes, Donna Kale. Okay. Yes, Donna Kale.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I have something to say that is maybe a little bit out of what the expectation of this meeting is. And I am a retiree from the Aerospace Corporation, and I worked there for 36 years. Over 10 years ago, probably closer to 15 years ago, some of you may remember that the Air Force Base was going to leave El Segundo because their employees, their uniformed officers and enlisted, could not find affordable housing in the South Bay. And this goes back long before the situation is like it is today. The base came very close to leaving. And if it weren't for the fact that the Army gave them Fort MacArthur up in San Pedro, we could have lost the base to Colorado Springs, which would have lost a lot of people and a lot of activities and a lot of commercial work in town. So we're 15 years or more down the street, and this has come up again in terms of housing. The enlisted and even the junior officers are having a hard time finding any kind of housing that's not far, far away. Fort Mac is not very big, and most of the people that are housed up there are senior officers. There's a small part for enlisted. So I just wanted to bring to the table the fact that I am not qualified at all to understand. I don't understand what if or if you will ever make some commercial property areas into housing areas like condos or places like that. But I would really ask you to think about the fact that El Segundo just got the Space Force. They're going to be part of the Space Force home. Will add to the other programs that are at the base. It probably won't be gigantic numbers of people because the base is relatively tiny, but there's going to be that need again. And see the Air Force pack up and go to a number of different options that they've got. Colorado Springs being, and New Mexico, Albuquerque being two of the ones that would, suck them up in a minute because they have tons of space. So I would like to at least think about this as far as this committee goes, to pay attention to what's going on with the Air Force and the grumbling about costs of housing. It takes like 20 officers, young junior officers, all rent a giant house in Hermosa in order to be able to live together. So it's just something I didn't want this group to overlook, that there's always that fear that if they leave, they're going to take a lot of stuff with them, including the commercial companies. I'm also just want to throw in, I expect that a lot of commercial properties will be in somewhat jeopardy of renting only because people are already griping about going back to work when they can do their work from home. So there could be opportunities to turn over some commercial areas into condos or something that's a little bit more affordable to people like the Air Force. I'm done.
Thank you, Ms. Kale. Appreciate that. Any other people on Zoom wishing to speak?
I currently see no other hands raised.
Okay, well, without further ado, it's great to see everybody. This is a first since I've been on city council, if you don't count the last time we attempted to get together. It's good to see everybody. Be great if we're all in person. But nonetheless, we're going to start. And I assume, Mr. Mitnick, you're going to, yeah.
I'm sorry, one person, and Nicolette just raised her hand.
Okay, great.
Nicolette?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me now? I don't know if you can hear me. I wanted to mention something. Should I do that now or wait?
No, you should do it now.
Okay. I'm a resident of El Segundo, been here for 16 years, and I'm a renter. And I wanted to address two things. Firstly, the fact that we don't have rent control, and rent control is not just, it's not something that is avoided in certain neighborhoods. They have it in Beverly Hills, they have it in Santa Monica. And regarding affordable housing, the fact that landlords are continuing to raise the rent means that even if there is affordable housing, it's no longer going to be affordable. And the second thing I want to address is that developers are buying houses and pulling out all the trees and the green space with no accountability for climate control. And that needs to be taken into consideration. I think there needs to be some kind of restriction on how much concrete they can put in, because these small houses that have backyards with trees and habitat are being ripped out and covered with concrete. And that just, it doesn't absorb carbon that we need. It doesn't absorb the pollutants, and we live between two very big pollutants. So those are the two areas I wanted to see if you're addressing anything about.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Do we have any other public communication before we go to roll call?
We do.
Okay.
I'm moving over Mark Eber. We're allowed to speak.
Yes, good evening or good afternoon. I just wanted to say that, I'm sorry, there's a bad echo. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to, I've been following, this is the first public meeting I've been to regarding this issue. I am trained and a practitioner within architecture and planning. I'm a resident of the city. And I just want to let you know that as you navigate this process, working with HCD and your housing element, that you're not the only city who's struggling with some of the issues that are being raised by some of the residents. And in fact, we recently just completed a process very similar to what you're going through in the city of Westlake Village. And so I would encourage you all to see how Westlake Village, which has very similar demographics to El Segundo, how they handled some of this very similar issues as you move forward in creating a plan, your housing element for the next 5 years. It would be really helpful. There's probably other cities in similar situations, but that could be a good blueprint. And like I said, some of the issues that I've seen on social media, or I've seen in the paper, or I've talked to neighbors, they're very similar. And so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You could actually see how other cities handled very similar situations. And I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you, Mr. Yever. Any other public comments?
I do not see any other hands raised.
Okay, Madam Clerk will do roll call, and then we'll see if Mr. Mitnick or anyone on staff would like to address any of those comments.
Mayor, members of the
Okay,
We're going to do roll call first, Scott.
Councilmember Giroux,
Here.
Councilmember Nickel,
Here.
Councilmember Perstuck,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Pimentel,
Here.
Mayor Boyles,
Here.
Chairperson Baldino,
Present.
Vice Chairperson Newman,
Here.
Commissioner Hochler,
I'm here.
Commissioner Keldorf,
Here.
and Commissioner Maggie.
Here.
Okay, everyone is here, Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Mitnick, would you like to address any of those comments?
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council and Planning Commissioners, we had 6 public speakers, 3 through email, 3 through Zoom. Most of these issues will be addressed during the presentation this evening, but I do want to call out the question about rent control. City Council, you may remember back in, I believe it was the fall and early winter of 2019, dealing with the impact of AB 1482, the statewide legislation, which in effect established rent control statewide. And there were some consequences here in El Segundo. So perhaps staff will talk about that a little bit more when we get to that part of the study session today. So if the 6 individuals who had comments today would bear with us, and this is a study session, you're not taking any action tonight. So the issues they raised, the 6 different speakers will be addressed this evening. And I'll make sure as we go through this, that we do cover that. And if we don't, we'll address it at the end of the meeting. So Mr. Mayor and Chair of the Planning Commission, I hope that would work for your 2 bodies.
Good for me.
Okay.
Yep, I agree. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, Mr. Mitnick, who's presenting today?
Our Paul Samaras with our Development Services Director. He will start this, and we have a team of Paul and Veronica Tam with Veronica Tam and Associates, and 2 consultants from CSG. They will be part of this effort. Okay, so Paul, I believe you're ready with a PowerPoint, all set to go, and if that's the case, I'll hand it off.
Okay, thank you, Scott. If we could share that PowerPoint so we can get started. Terrific. Good evening, Mayor Boyles and fellow council members, Chair Baldino and fellow commissioners. I appreciate your time and attention this evening on the important topic of housing, and more specifically, our general plan housing element. Tonight, we would like to report to you on the housing element update process and to get your feedback as we work on preparing the city's next housing element. For your benefit and the public watching, our presentation will include first a basic description of what a housing element is and why cities need to update it. Second, we will share with you a preliminary map of potential housing locations in the city. This is called a site inventory. This inventory will actually become part of our housing element when it is adopted. Third, we want to report to you on our efforts to engage the public and gauge the community's attitudes on housing. And lastly, as I mentioned, we will appreciate having your thoughts as our team works on drafting the next housing element for the city. Before I go further, I would like to introduce the consulting team that will be making tonight's presentation with me. Next, please. So we have Veronica Tam from Veronica Tam and Associates. This is the primary housing element consultant for the city. Veronica and her company drafted the city's last housing element and is working with us on this new housing element effort. Gina Gizar and Layla Carver are from CSG Consultants and have assisted us specifically with the preliminary site inventory and our community outreach efforts. Just as a side note, Gina and Layla's work with CSG are actually funded through a grant that the city obtained, the SB2 grant that the state gives to cities to help them with updating their housing elements. So moving into our presentation, I just want to provide some basic background information before I turn it over to Veronica. So next. California law requires all cities to adopt a general plan, and general plans are required to have 7 specific elements or chapters that you see on the left side. The housing element is one of those required elements, but cities can have additional option elements. El Segundo's general plan has 3 additional option elements that you see there in the middle of the screen. Next. Housing elements are adopted or updated every 8 years per state law. So our next housing element will cover the next 8 years until the end of 2029. With that, I will hand things off to Veronica, who will go over in more detail what is a housing element, what it includes, and why it is important to update it.
Great, thank you, Paul. This is Veronica. I'm going to go over a housing element. What is the housing element and some of the basic requirements of the housing element? Just like Paul mentioned that the housing element is part of your general plan. It's a policy document. Even though there's a lot of technical details in it, but ultimately it's still a policy document. It sets the goals, policy, and objectives as it comes to providing the housing needs in the community. And we need to look at how the city is going to accommodate the needs of your residents, not only your current residents, but your future residents. One of the key components of the housing element is meeting the city's share of the regional housing needs. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. What sets the housing element apart from the rest of the general plan is that general plans usually have a 20-25-year planning horizon. The housing element must be updated every 8 years or so and on a statutory deadline. No other elements of the general plan has this type of requirement. The statutory deadline of the housing element is October 15, 2021. So what we need to do, as stated in the government code, is that the housing element must be updated within 120 days of the statutory deadline. That actually put the drop dead date of the housing element update to February 12, 2022. The housing element is also different from the rest of the general plan in that it has to be reviewed by a state agency for compliance with state law. The agency responsible for that is the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. Next slide. So the housing element does certain things, but it also doesn't do certain things. And when we look at the housing element, it's like we said before, it is a policy document legally required to plan for where housing may be built. but it's not a requirement that the city builds the housing because private sector builds housing. The city doesn't actually act as developer and function to build housing. The housing element serves to set the stage for the overall where housing can occur, how much housing, what type of housing through your general plan, zoning, and other planning documents. It kind of describe all of that in the housing element, but it's your land use element, it's your zoning ordinance actually set the density and destination of where housing can occur. The city may also use funding, policies, programs, and incentives to facilitate housing development, but the city technically does not function as a developer, and the housing element does not approve any housing project in itself. Approving the housing element does not approve any housing projects. Next slide. So there are some really more detailed requirements of the housing element. If you look at the government codes, the housing element is codified in the government code, and it's probably have about 200 and 300 pages of regulations relating to the housing element. Unlike the rest of the general plan, its guidelines, the housing element has statutory requirements. One of that key requirements is the regional housing needs allocation, RHNA process, which is mandated by the state to look at how much housing is needed in the region and what is the city's share of that region and its overall housing needs. Again, we'll go into that a little bit later, but we have to, in the housing element, look at where are the potential for new housing production. Where can we plan for that, and what type of housing? We also need to preserve existing affordable housing in the community. That's another requirement of the housing element. The state recognizes that it's very expensive to build affordable housing. Therefore, preserving what you currently have is an important requirement. You also need to be providing safe and quality housing that's currently in the city, making sure that you preserve the conditions of your existing housing stock and certainly improving it if possible. While the city is not required to actually build any housing as part of the housing element, you're required to facilitate housing production. In that regard, it really is looking at your development regulations and policies and making sure that your development regulations and policies are not constraining housing development and that you have incentives to facilitate all types of housing in your community. And we talked about facilitating the production of all income groups. However, the focus is certainly on the low and moderate income groups because the market in itself takes care of the above moderate income. As a local jurisdiction, you want to make sure that your development regulations and land use policies are there to facilitate particularly the lower income housing and moderate income housing. Also, housing needs for the special needs. Based on state law, the special needs populations are defined as the elderly, disabled, homeless, large households that have 5 or more members, female-headed households, and farm workers. These are the 6 particular groups that are defined in state law as special needs population that the housing element must address, but there are additional special needs groups that local jurisdictions could add to your housing element. We've seen cities, if they're located near a military base, they may add military personnel to the special needs group. If you're located near a college, you may want to add college students as a special needs group because those people tend to have a transient kind of characteristics in terms of their housing needs, and they have more of an impact on your local rental housing market. And last but not least is the fair housing requirement. The state adopted a new law in 2017, AB 686, affirmatively furthering fair housing. In terms of the housing element, a lot of things that we do in the housing elements, it's now being evaluated by the state with from the lens of equal access to opportunity. So that's something that we will have to address in the housing element as well. Next slide. When you have a housing element law that is housing element is probably the most legally regulated element of the entire general plan. Like I mentioned before, the government codes has probably 200-300 pages of regulations on housing element. When you have that kind of strict statutory requirements, then and that you have a state agency responsible for reviewing the housing element for compliance with state law, there are consequences of non-compliance. Mainly is the risk of litigation. The housing element is the most frequently litigated element of the general plan, or housing related laws are probably the most litigated law as well. So back in 2017, the state passed AB 72 and AB 101, which really gives the state agency, HCD, a lot more teeth in terms of monitoring non-compliance. Specifically, if a city is continue to be out of compliance with the housing element law, HCD can refer that city to the state attorney for litigation. That certainly happened to the city of Huntington Beach back in 2018. Huntington Beach was sued by the attorney general, and they settled and ends up having to plan for more housing than they originally had to be responsible for. If you are in a lawsuit situation and your housing element does not have compliance status from the state, then the court could impose fines for up to $10,000 per unit and up to $100,000 per month for the first 3 months of non-compliance. And if you continue to not being able to get the housing element up to compliance, that fine can go up to $300,000 per month for the next 3 months. So beyond the first 6 months, then the fine can go up to $600,000 per month. So that can be very financially burdening to a lot of communities if that happens. The other risk of litigation is the court can suspend the ability to issue building permits. The city of Pleasanton was sued by the Attorney General, and the city was not able to issue building permits for over a year. And this is not just residential building permits, this is any building permits, because the housing element is an integral component of your general plan. If you have an integral component of your general plan being out of compliance, then it renders the entire general plan at risk. And because you don't have an adequate general plan, you wouldn't have the ability to issue building permits. So the city of Pleasanton, its building permit authority, I believe, was suspended for more than a year. Same thing happened to San Clemente. They were not able to issue building permits for more than a year. The housing element itself was not sued by the state or by any nonprofit, but their policies regarding how to deal with the homeless was sued by nonprofits, and the court withheld the city of San Clemente's ability to issue building permits for more than a year as well. The other kind of consequence of non-compliance is certainly not being able to receive state grants like the SB2 grants, the REAP grants, or the LEAP grants. Those are the grants that are administered by the state agency, HCD. If you do not have a housing element that complies with state law, you would not be eligible. And Paul mentioned earlier that the site inventory work is being funded by state grants, and definitely if your housing element, if your fifth cycle housing element were not complying with state law, the city would not have been eligible for that funding. there are certainly more funding that are being considered by the state to put that onto kind of like as a way to carrots and sticks for having housing element compliance. Another thing too, for example, low-income housing tax credits, which is something that is which is the most important affordable housing fund in California and in the nation. If our housing element in El Segundo is not complying with state law, your nonprofits would not be competitive at all in applying for that type of funding. So the next slide relates to the regional housing needs allocation. We mentioned before that's probably the most critical component of the housing element. Virtually no housing element in the state would get certified if they're not able to get accommodate the regional housing needs allocation. The fifth cycle RHNA for El Segundo is 69 units. The law has substantially changed since 2017, and that's the reason why the RHNA for the SCAG region has increased substantially, and that impacts certainly trickle down to the city of El Segundo. Your RHNA is 492 units. While it is significantly larger than what the city has seen in the past, it is comparatively smaller compared to some of your neighbors, even with Manhattan Beach and Hermosa Beach. And if you look at some of the larger jurisdictions surrounding the city, like Hawthorne and Redondo Beach, their numbers are much higher. So everybody in the state gets a higher number this round of the housing element cycle. Everybody in the SCAG region is particularly get a really large number because SCAG is the largest region in the state. Next slide. So the RHNA is divided into income categories for your 492 units. It's divided into very low, low, moderate, and above moderate income. Now, the very low is defined as people who make up to 50% of the area median income, AMI. Low income are people who make up to 80% of the area median income. So for a household of 4 in current year, a low-income household can be making about $90,000 and still considered low-income household in LA County. Moderate income is people who make up to 120% of the AMI, and above moderate income are people who make anything above that. So when we talk about lower income households these days in LA County particularly, these are people who are working and probably working very hard, but still not still considered to be lower income because of the cost of living in LA is so high. Now, in the income distribution, it doesn't mean that you're going to build the units in these income categories because you're not building any units. You must have land use policy that can facilitate the potential development of these units in this type of income categories. What the state is actually saying is at a certain density of development, it's more feasible to accommodate lower income. And so what we're looking at is about 30 units to the acre. That is a density that is considered to be feasible for lower income housing. Therefore, we're looking for zoning that can accommodate housing at about 30 units to the acre. Moderate and above moderate income. Moderate, typically, we're talking about condos, townhomes that can be in a medium density category. And above moderate income, essentially, unless you have single family neighborhoods, well, typically it's in single family homes or even something lower density. But in El Segundo, because we don't have a lot of we don't necessarily have a lot of remaining single family lots for new units, we may have to go to more moderate and medium density even for your above moderate income. So with that, I pass on to Gina to go over the site's inventory.
Well, hello there. This is Gina Gazar, and I am going to expand on the sites inventory that Veronica touched on. So, of course, the sites inventory is one of the key requirements of the housing element. This is how you're going to achieve your arena obligation. So, as we were tasked with really going through the entire city and reviewing your entire city. So the sites inventory consists ultimately of a list of parcels that could feasibly be developed or redeveloped to accommodate your arena. And HCD has several requirements. One of them is that they have to have site suitability. And that means a lot of things, and we'll kind of touch on that. So we need to look at the city's zoning code and policy as it exists. We look at individual lot sizes to see what types of homes could be accommodated. And lot size, of course, is tied to just the feasibility of a project. You wouldn't want, for example, an affordable housing developer. They like to see typically between 50 and 150 units, but they may want to see less. So we took that into consideration. We also wanted to make sure that there were limited environmental constraints. You know, you're not in a high fire hazard zone. We wanted to make sure that there was adequate infrastructure. So, you know, basic things, sewer, water, dry utilities. And then we looked at development trends. You know, if a site was borderline, but there is a lot of development activity, you know, that's worth consideration. So there are additional criteria. We look at underutilized sites. That means the site's not developed to its full capacity. That can mean perhaps it's, you know, it's zoned for 18D per acre, but there are only 2 per acre. And, you know, you look at how that affects the overall neighborhood. We looked at sites with older buildings, and not just older as in, you know, old, but dilapidated or, you know, construction defaults, things like that. Sites with the potential for mixed use. So that means their location would potential retail mixed with residential be feasible at a site. And of course, we also looked at proximity to amenities. So grocery stores, public services, schools, healthcare, things of those nature. So this is a draft site inventory map, and that's one of the requirements. We needed to map these out. So this represents 31 sites in the city, and that it equates to about 665 dwelling units, which is a 35% buffer over your 492 required RENA obligation. We're going to zoom in a little bit so you can see some of these sites closer. We had some sites that were in the downtown Grand area. And we had some sites that were just west of Pacific Coast Highway. And I'll move on to a little cheat sheet, I'll call this, because it gives more perspective of what each of these sites really yields. And just to clarify, we do have some sites that are pending projects. That means that
can you clarify? Sorry to interrupt, but can you clarify?
No,
is there a legend for the colors?
Yes, we've got a legend, definitely. Let me pull that up. I gotta go back here. Let's see the easiest way. It's at the end here. Whoa, okay. Hold on. Here. Y'all see that?
Yeah, we can see that. Thank you.
Yeah, so we actually have one single family parcel, but that's a pending project. It's on the boards. We've got, And I could quickly run through the number of each parcel that we have, but
That's okay. I don't know about others. I took a picture of it just so when you go back to that one
gotcha,
screen, it's
gotcha.
clear what you're looking at. Okay, thanks.
And I will go back now. Bear with me. So let's see. Hey, come on, you can do this. All right. Well, now it might. So you see there's, these sites typically are getting you a minimum of 10 DU total. And then we've got larger sites that accommodate more. With HCD, the requirement for to be considered adequate to accommodate low income housing, you have to accommodate at least 16 units total on a parcel. But that, there is also the ability to consolidate lots, which, we won't go into much here, but some of these lots are several lots combined. So you can see here, this parcel on Grand is actually 4 different parcels. So that's 30 DU total. So moving on, here's the list in its entirety. And we did want to point out that in addition to the sites that were identified, we include the ADUs that are predicted to be built over the next 8 years. And the prediction it's based on the development precedent that's been set in the last, I say 3 years or since the city's been tracking ADUs, and based on the ADUs that have been constructed, not just on the boards or approved, but constructed, it is estimated that there would be about 80 DU total. So that brings your total accommodation up to 745 DU, which is a 51% buffer. And this is good for HCD because they know sites might drop off over the 6th cycle, and that gives them more certainty that you'll be able to accommodate your RENA obligation. So I just wanted to touch on the implementation of the sites inventory, and the approach is going to be with 2 overlay zones. So the overlay zones, we're calling them RENA overlay zones because they will directly, they will be associated with the map. You'll have, you're not going to add other sites. With this overlay zone, we want it to be easily implementable by city staff. And, you don't want to just throw any site on there. We've looked at these sites very carefully, and this implementation tool would, so let's get into it. So the RENA overlay, this is a minimum of 30 DU per acre, which is the HCD's requirement. They want you to look at the minimum of what a range of densities would be. So all of the sites in your inventory, save for those that are just west of Pacific Coast Highway, those would all have this overlay zone, the RENA 30 to 40 DU per acre overlay. So the sites would retain their base zone until a housing application is submitted. And then once the overlay zone is implemented, then that's when the overlay zone, the commercial zone, if there is a non-residential base zone or existing zone, that is, it no longer exists. And so for the RENA mixed use overlay zone, this is for all of the sites that are adjacent to PCH. So this is a 40 to 50 DU per acre density with the minimum 40. And this will allow for the mix of residential and non-residential. So you still have the character of the commercial along PCH. And of course, a general plan update will be required because you're going to intensify some densities and you are going to introduce residential in some areas where it is strictly.
May I interject? I'm sorry. I see
Yes,
several
please.
hands up. It's hard to see everyone in presentation mode, but Mr. Baldino and Mr. McGay both have their hands up. So let's go to Mr. Baldino
Okay.
first.
Let's do that. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I didn't want to interrupt. My question is, when you're selecting these sites and these commercial properties and talking about overlaying with housing zones, has there been an attempt to reach out to the landowners and business owners who are currently at these sites? Has there been any feedback from the property owners on this process?
At this point, so no, not yet.
Okay, how would that process work before we start rezoning private property? What are the steps that we would go through to get, input and feedback from these folks?
Well, the city has different options for that process, and we've talked a little bit about that. And anybody else on the team, please jump in. But it would start with just generally reaching out at first and explaining that this is the first step in an 8-year process, and that that their site is safe. They don't need to move out, or you're not in jeopardy. It's still just a the first step, and work with them, let them know how the process is going to play out, that it's a policy document, that there's explain the reasons why it has qualified for the inventory. And in most cases, these sites are, we suspect that the owners are not going to be surprised.
Gina, this is Veronica, and if I can interrupt too. The reason why we use an overlay idea is exactly to respect the current uses on the ground. And this is the overlay only gives the property owner an additional option. If should they want to redevelop in the future, or if they want to sell in the future. But the housing element does not obligate any property owner to build, to move, to sell, or to redevelop. So it's just giving them an additional use. And think about this as adding another permitted use to the list of permitted uses in the zoning code.
Yeah, that I understand. But at the end of the day, you're asking us to update and change our general plan to add these overlay zones in order to qualify.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Did we have other questions?
Yeah, Mr. Brigay had his hand up. Kevin?
Thank you, Drew. I actually did not have my hand up, but I'll take this time to ask a couple clarifying questions. First, for ADUs, there's no requirement for them to be quote unquote affordable housing, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then the mandatory maps, just to clarify, all the number of units is generally all the units, not for affordable housing, right?
I missed a few words, but we did. So the short answer is they are all considered. No one's assigned a specific affordability, but we, for the sake of satisfying HCD, we have explained which sites could feasibly accommodate lower income that meet HCD criteria. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, so out of the 665, how many of those would meet the criteria for affordable housing?
Let me pull up my sheet here. Basically, there are only a handful that would not meet the criteria. there are maybe about 200 that would not meet the criteria.
Okay, so that 35% buffer then. So we need 400 some odd units for affordable housing, right?
Well, if there are low and very low,
Uh-huh.
and then there's moderate and above moderate. So we need, we can go back.
Gina, if I may, it may help to go back to the
Yeah.
earlier slides. I have the breakdown. There we go.
So we need 189 very low and 88 low. And there are specific criteria for those. You know, they, like I explained, they have to accommodate 16 units, they have to be, or it's preferable that they're at least a half acre and no larger than 10 acres. And there's also the locations according to, I got to get this acronym right, the affirmatively, help me, Veronica, affirmatively, well, it's fair house, affirmatively promoting fair housing. So the HCD wants to make sure that they're not all just grouped into one spot in the city where you've designated, okay, all our affordable housing is just going on, you know, this area. So, but your city is pretty small and diverse. There isn't one area that would be unsuitable for affordable housing. So in that sense, it was, you know, most of the sites met the criteria.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you.
You've got Gina and Veronica, there's several hands up. I see Mrs. Kildorf with her hand up and Mr. Heschler and Mayor Pro Tem Pimentel. So you got quite a few. Why don't you start with Michelle? Michelle, we'll go to you.
Hey, thank you. A question, maybe jumping ahead or maybe a reinterpretation of Kevin's question, but with the overlay zone, so you're now at 30 to 40 units. Is the requirement that in order to achieve the overlay zone, all of those units have to be affordable?
No.
No, as we mentioned before, it's only zoning so that it's feasible to facilitate lower income. It's not that you will actually build them. They could, but what it really means is at 30 units to the acre, a nonprofit has a better shot to build a financially penciled out project that they can go to the state and apply for funding, and the amounts of subsidies that they're going to request is not going to be prohibitive. So what you're looking for is zoning feasibility. It's not that you're building them as affordable housing.
Right. I guess my question is, though, if there's no requirement to make a percentage of those affordable, you know, a landowner is, we have to assume, going to go with whatever the highest and best use is.
Right.
So if 100% market rate developer is typically going to over compete or compete at an advantage with an affordable housing developer, I know that's not always the case because of subsidies in play, but do we have any ability to make the overlay zone have an inclusionary component, or what other tools do we have to make sure that some of those new developed units are in fact affordable?
I believe the city is exploring inclusionary. Also that's the reason why there is the buffer that is so high, just so that when one site gets off and being built as market rate, you have other sites available in the future. But I believe the city is exploring inclusionary.
If I may add to that, Veronica, and Commissioner Veronica mentioned earlier that the housing elements may contain policies or may need to be accompanied by other city policies that promote or facilitate development of affordable housing units. So I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of efforts that the city is sort of undertaking. One is the selection of an affordable housing services provider, a nonprofit developer that will partner with the city and to help identify sites or ways to develop areas of the city with affordable housing. And if you may recall, a few years ago, the city acquired about $5 million of funding to assist with that effort. So that is one example of what the city is doing to supplement the housing element and the zoning. In addition, we just recently kicked off work with another consulting firm to potentially put together an inclusionary housing ordinance. It wouldn't be part of the housing element, a document itself, but it would be something that the city will sort of consider. And as part of that effort, we will look into either providing incentives or requiring, a certain percentage of affordable units within a housing development. But that hasn't been determined yet. We've just initiated that process, and we will be, soliciting public input and input from the commission and from the city council when we work on that as well. So those are a few examples of what the city can do to facilitate and help ensure that some affordable units are developed without making it a requirement in the housing element itself.
Michelle, did I answer your question?
It did, and I don't know, maybe that's something that once we go through the whole presentation is kind of just opened up for discussion. I feel like I've been on both sides of the table and working for market rate developers and affordable housing developers who will look at the housing element as a place to start. And being on this side, I'm sensitive to competition between those two groups over the same sites. So that's just something to maybe talk through as a group once we get through the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Gelder. We're going to go to Mr. Heschler and then Mayor Pro Tem after that.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Two quick questions. One, I've had several neighbors and residents ask, how does the state determine our RHNA numbers and the percentages? And I think that's an easy answer. But the second one is, if we do this plan, which we're going to, of course, the city's not responsible for developing. What happens if after the 8 years, if we do the plan, submit it to HDC or HCD, what happens if we don't deliver the units within the 8 years? What's the penalty for that?
This is Veronica. I'll cover those topics. First of all, the RHNA is a state mandated process. It's, the state projected how much growth needed for the entire state. And then it's 3.5 million new units for the entire state for the next 8-10 years. And SCAG being Southern California Association of Governments being the largest region in the state, we got the lion's share of that. We got 1.34 million new units allocated to the entire region. And SCAG, through its methodology that focuses primarily on access to transportation and access to jobs, divvy up the 1.34 million units with 812,000 units or so in LA County. Each jurisdiction get a number. Your number is relatively low compared to some other jurisdictions of your size because of some of the constraints that you have, and also access to transit and access to transit. I think that's an issue that you may not. The reason why you're not getting a large number compared to some of your neighbors. But that whole process of regional housing needs allocation is complete. The RHNA was adopted back in March this year, and so that this is a number, it's a planning goal, it's not a production obligation. If you fail to meet the planning obligation, like plan for sites, then the RHNA is cumulative. It would add on to your next cycle as a carrying forward burden. If you plan for it and it didn't happen, you've met your obligation, then the RHNA is not cumulative. You will get a new RHNA the next cycle, the 7th cycle, and we don't know what that number will be because it all depends on the economic situation at the time. So we don't have that crystal ball to know what is your next number. But what we do know is if you plan for it, but it didn't happen, it would not become cumulative. But if you fail to plan for it, whatever you could not accommodate would become cumulative to the next cycle.
Jay, did that answer your question?
It did, thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Pimentel.
Hi there, two questions. First question is, if a property owner has this overlay, are they obligated to, if they transfer the property, convert it, or can they sell it to someone as is? Even if that might be financially not feasible, but is it still possible that if it's an R2, they could sell it for an R2 use and not be scaled up?
Right, so the overlay zone is not implemented until a housing application comes in and is approved. So they could theoretically sell and maintain this same zoning, but they would have to disclose that it's been, that it has this overlay and is intended for the residential density.
Got it. So the second question is, are we creating a property right with this overlay, or if there's a change in state law or the calculus around RHNA numbers, can we remove the overlay, or are we creating a property right?
If I'm trying to understand this a little bit, so the question is, if you don't need it anymore, then can you remove it?
That's correct.
Okay.
Let's say a constitutional amendment goes through that forbids meddling in land use and local politics. Would we be able to remove this, or are we creating a property right for that landowner and they can litigate against the city?
I'm not an attorney, so I don't know about the right to litigate on that. But however, you could remove it and not use this strategy for your next cycle of the RHNA, or the. I don't know whether the RHNA would be reduced, but in the event that the RHNA is changed, and then you don't need it, you could remove properties from the overlay. Or for the seventh cycle of the housing element, let's say your RHNA went back down to like 10 units or 50 units, and you only need 1 or 2 properties to meet your RHNA, so you don't need to apply. You can rezone in a way to kind of remove the, you can change the zoning code to remove the overlay, or change the overlay.
So we can remove an overlay without addressing. I don't know. This might be something for. I mean, Ryan, do you know this? I don't sound like the city attorney.
I'll defer to Mark Hensley.
We're creating property. Yeah, as I say, I don't know if we're creating a property right here or not, but that certainly makes a significant difference to our calculus.
Well, there's a couple of issues. First, whether you're creating a property right or not, I would say generally no. Now, that doesn't mean somebody won't sue the city over if there's what they would consider to be a down zoning from a higher density or lower density. But there's also another law that comes in play, and based upon some past legislation, and that is, unless that, which requires if a local government takes property and reduces the units currently, you're required to put those someplace else. Now, if this hypothetical legislation, ballot measure, whatever, were to get passed and address that also, then potentially you could remove that additional or that increased zoning without having to move it somewhere else. So there are a number of laws at play with regard to that question. Did I answer that?
That was the Yogi Berra answer. If there's a fork in the road, we will take it.
Well, if that ballot measure covers all these issues that the state has created and wipes them all out, then we could avoid all of that.
Understood. Thank you.
Councilor Giroux, I got a note that you might have. There you go. I see your hand up now. Lance, turn over to you.
All right. So can you go back to, I think it's slide 17, your site inventory? I think it's just up one. Yeah, this one here. So I have a question. I'm looking down at like a big red flag
and it's 1217 East Mariposa Avenue, single family R1 current zoning, 9-unit overlay potentially. Why is this in here?
That is a pending project. There's already a development application in for that site. So we added it because the city will get credit for their arena obligation.
But we don't have any zoning for it currently. And I know one of the first things that we mentioned as a council, if I'm not, hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn, the rest of my colleagues, I apologize up front, was to protect the R1 areas of the city. That was a pretty strong ask on our part. So when I look at this, I understand you're trying to fill in numbers, but that one scares me a little bit because that's obviously going to be something that's going to have to come up in the future. I know that any owner of a property has the right to ask for a zoning change, but I don't think this is something necessarily that would that kind of gives me any clarity on the inventory list. So that being said, since we are adding in potentially things that are not currently zoned, there's a couple things I didn't see, and maybe they're coming on later in the project is east of PCH and Imperial. Are these things that you've looked at? Am I going to see this later on? I know it came up as something when we did the when we asked the questions to the on the survey. Is this something coming up later?
At this point, no. We've looked at those sites and they don't meet HCD's criteria to be included. Like, for example, the Imperial sites are in the noise contours of the airport. So we saw that as a constraint, and we had looked at them, we had included them, and then we decided, let's remove them.
Okay, but again, I'm not a housing expert by any stretch of the imagination. However, there is currently housing there.
Exactly.
So why would it not be good enough for HCD if there's currently housing?
Well, if we could make that argument with them, but it's when we already have a list that meets your site's inventory, we thought, why would we put the city in that position where you have to defend sites that aren't as suitable as others? So
this is Layla, just to respond a little bit more to Council Member Giroux. The sites that are in the airport noise contour are something that we could add back to the site inventory if we'd like to do that. But it would require that the ALUC, the LAX ALUC review our housing element, and there'd also be some additional environmental review that would be required. One of the state's criteria is to limit the amount of environmental analysis for sites on the list.
Okay, it's just that we obviously are a very small city with a very small housing area, and to be crossing things off the list that are potentially something that we could utilize just doesn't make much sense to me right now. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lance. Okay, Commissioner Keldorf had her hand up as well.
Okay, a couple of questions. So density 30 to 40, 40 to 50, is there an opportunity to go above that? And I'm asking because there are a couple sites on PCH, and we know that there are pending projects on PCH that are, proposed to exceed that density. So how would we handle that? And then if are there additional sites that are not on this list that we would be open to talking about in this forum?
So let's start with the pending projects. So we have to look at those as separate from, they're not going to have the overlay zone. The only way the Pacific Coast Commons project would be designated with the overlay zone is if it no longer was a pending project. So if it was, denied. But we don't want to look at these projects as having future overlay zones. They're gonna, whatever the ultimate approval is, they'll have that designation.
I'm thinking of that almost in reverse. Like if we're gonna have a specific plan on PCH that's at 80 units to the acre, but then we're limiting a property, on the next block to 40 units to the acre. What would the approval mechanism, I guess, look like for that? So they would take a site on this list and still have to go back in as a specific plan in the same way that Pacific Commons is doing.
Well, that is one mechanism, but if the city feels strongly that they would rather see higher density, then that's something that we need to entertain now. If you feel PCH should be 50 to 60, then that's what we would look at. We didn't want to go, we had to start somewhere. We didn't want to have a huge gap between the 30 to 40 D per acre and then, go buck wild. We understand that this type of density is new to the city. So we started with a reasonable number, knowing that there still might be mixed use. So there would be other uses there. Once you start looking at 50, 60, you're going to have really tall buildings and more traffic and, parking them. So we kind of, we just started high and then scaled back to what we thought we could see. But, like I said, that's not set in stone, the 40 to 50.
And I'm asking just because for some of this conversation, I think it would be nice to have a group like Many Mansions participating, because I don't want to speak, out of turn, but from the development side, there are densities that are kind of awkward if you're a developer to build to. And in my experience, 30 to 40 becomes more costly than 20, and you don't get enough of a benefit as you do above 50. So sometimes we rezone properties and then they hang out in this density that doesn't make them as compelling for either townhome or higher density that would accommodate some affordable. And I'm curious kind of what economics with developers, whether they're affordable developers or a more traditional mixed use market rate developers, there have been to make sure that we're zoning properties that then are going to actually attract the uses that we're looking for.
So that's a great point. So, and we do, if I may, I know that we do have a representative from Many Mansions here. If it's appropriate to bring him on now, Mr. Alex, do we want to wait?
Mr. Mitnick is chomping on the bit. Scott, let's turn over to Scott and then see if you want to bring Many Mansions back, please.
Yeah, we have Mr. Mayor, members of the council and planning commissioners. The site inventory list that's in front of you, that's on the screen here, listening to the discussion, we should have broken it up into sections. The first should have showed you within the existing zoning, what can be done, what are underutilized parcels. So the areas in the blue coloring, correct? That's what that does. Is that right for our consultants? That's correct?
The area in the blue, those are the sites that will be rezoned with an overlay zone.
Or will be zoned?
Yes.
Okay. Did you answer the question? Because I see it in three ways. One is, what's the existing zoning and what are we short in terms of land use and what opportunities are there? That has the least barrier. And second would be projects that are pending that are about to request zone changes and that type of thing. And then the third category would be the theoretical changes that could be made, such as Pacific Coast Commons. Do we have the ability, based on what's in front of us now, to convey that information to the council and planning commission? I think that would help make it more clear. And if not, we can come back and do that separately.
No, certainly. So if we were just to max out the density at the current existing allowable density and plus include the pending projects, you're not going to meet the 492. You get to about 364. Yes.
So that's significant progress at 364 if you get to that, and that's a big if. Then you look at theoretical opportunities such as Pacific Coast Highway and maybe some others, and then you would hit the target.
Well, we could, but we also have to accommodate sites, the low and very low. And if you have to have at least 30 DU per acre for HCD to recognize those sites as able to accommodate the low and very low. So if we were just, the as is per, at your maximum R3, that's your highest density zoning district in the city, that only allows 27 DU per acre. So as the city exists, you wouldn't be able to accommodate any affordable housing according to HCD's requirements. So in that case, you'd either have to bump that up. There'd have to be some kind of manipulation to the zoning code or zoning text amendment. There has to be some change. And then once some of these sites, as you can see, are C2s, your commercial sites, they accommodate 10 or 12 DU per acre. So those are very low. Plus you'd still have to rezone those to, they can't be 100%, the likelihood of them being 100% residential in the next 8 years, it's harder to make that argument to HCD. We could attempt to, but then we don't want to get the city in the predicament of having to try and justify sites to, we don't want to jeopardize the certification of the document. But, we could go through and show different scenarios and make the city feel more comfortable. And I do want to add, though, I know I didn't answer both questions. Ms. Keldoff asked if any additional sites could be looked at. I wanted to mention that we did add one site since the last, between our rescheduled meeting and today, we did add one site. So it was the 205 Lomita, and that was a borderline site that it didn't meet the criteria as well as some of the other sites, and we left it off. But since it was requested, it was specifically requested that we look at it, we did again and added it back into the list. So just wanted to make that clear.
I see Councilman Perstook's hand up, but before we go there, Michelle, do you feel like you made that, coming from your subject matter expertise viewpoint in the development space, you made that argument that why consider 30 or 40 when we might be wanting to consider 80? Do you feel like that point was addressed before we move on?
We talked about it. I don't really know how to address it because I'm sure that that's going to get into a much bigger conversation about where that's appropriate and what, we do want kind of the character of certain areas of the city to look like. And again, maybe many mansions can be included in this conversation at some point. 30 to 40 units to the acre is typically hard to achieve as a walk-up. So a stair-only 3-story walk-up property. You need, typically, in my experience, elevators to make that work. And you're looking at a totally different product type that carries costs, and then you have a price per unit valuation that gets skewed. So sometimes I think cities believe that they're incentivizing developers to build at these densities that ultimately wind up being a little awkward. So a for sale townhome developer will never be able to build 30 units to the acre. So you're going to take them kind of, if that's the minimum, threshold. You're going to take them out of consideration. And then affordable developers will have to see if they're going to get, enough economies of scale to be able to qualify for the various funding sources that are out there. And I'm speaking from, I've looked at a few sites in Gardena that has a mixed use overlay where the minimum is 30 units to the acre. And I know groups that have spent a lot of time with city staff saying, can we do 25 or can we do, more than 50? We're just stuck with what can be built there. And so I don't want to go through this whole effort and then find that we're not attracting the right types of developers for these sites, if that's the intention.
Okay, maybe staff could take a note of that, Scott, before we go to Councilmember Perstuck and take that into consideration. I guess the question is, do we want to check the box from a RENA standpoint and comply with the HCD requirement, or do we really want to fulfill some housing, some new housing in town or redevelopment? That's more of a, I think, kind of fundamental intent question, but Councilmember Perstuck.
Yeah, so my question was, how are these sites picked? Is it because someone has expressed interest in developing them specifically? Because it seems a little bit like a site here, a site there. Or did we, I thought we were going to look at the whole town to say, here's an area that could be rezoned or have an overlay. And then my second question is, you've identified sites that are parking, like at 533 Main and then the Franklin parking area. Parking's a premium in our Smoky Hollow area. So, are we putting housing before parking when we already have a parking shortage in that area? And, that 533 Main spot, is that the public parking that the high school uses as well as the library? So I'm just kind of, I'm just trying to understand why, is parking not something we care about anymore? And so we're just going to say we can put houses there. Those are my two questions.
So I'll start. So when we started this process, we looked at the entire city and slowly started weeding out sites that would not meet the HCD's criteria. And, we analyzed, we looked at sites, we looked at records, and ultimately after a long iterative process, these were the sites that really could feasibly meet the HCD's criteria. So like we explained, adequate infrastructure, and of course the whole city has adequate infrastructure, but could feasibly, realistically be redeveloped in the next 8 years. So older buildings that, sites that were underutilized. And then we came up with this. With the parking, now that's tricky. That's very tricky. And I don't know that I can give you a adequate answer because, of course, parking is like gold. You can't, I think in this case, because the city has an obligation to the state and we had to weigh between the two, the housing overrode. But you bring up a good point. So, if parking is, if you feel very strongly that a site should not be included because of backlash, then we have to consider that.
And then like the area around Indiana Court, Illinois, that area, that wasn't considered as far as any changes.
Are you? If I may jump in here for a second,
yeah.
Gina, Councilwoman, that particular area is zoned R3, so it's just west of PCH. And we actually studied that area. Commissioner Kilduff may remember from a couple of years ago. And we found out that area is actually already developed at densities higher than what we allow today. There are properties that are developed at 35, 40 units to the acre. So there's not a lot of potential to add more units on those properties. Yeah, so we did look at that particular neighborhood.
I thought that the neighborhood, the reason why a lot of those complexes have not been developed is because the zoning rules changed. And so it didn't pencil for them to actually, like some of the zoning rules have changed in the FARs. So it didn't pencil anymore. But I don't know. I feel like this feels to me like we're just picking little pieces and, areas to check off a box, but we're not really looking at the bigger picture.
I should also add that there's the no net loss rule. So any of the sites, if they were rezoned and the density was intensified, you only get credit for the units in excess of what you are replacing. So if you are already at 35 DU per acre and you develop at 40 DU per acre, you get those 5 units credit. So you've gone through that effort and you're not really gaining much. You're not going to be able to meet your obligation.
And if I can also interject, you will not actually be able to qualify a site like that. There are multiple reasons why putting it on existing residential uses being very difficult. One, HCD would not accept the feasibility of knocking down a 20-unit apartment and building 30 units. Yes, you'll net in 10 units, but HCD would not even consider that as financially feasible for lower income housing, so that would not be acceptable. Two, there is the new state law, AB 1397, has a replacement requirement, and honestly, I think they adopted a provision that works against them. As a project approval, as a condition of project approval, the developer must replace the existing units that are either deed restricted as low income use or occupied by lower income households. So it makes it very difficult for a site with existing residential apartments that potentially has some low-income households, for example, seniors in there, that they're considered low. A lot of them are considered low income because they don't generate a lot of income. And the developer is required to replace the affordable units on site. That particular piece of state law makes it very difficult to utilize existing residential uses for lower income RENA. But what I also wanted to mention too is, I think you're concerned about this kind of like sporadic kind of pattern of the sites. But I think in terms of if you want to think big and do planning with a bigger picture in mind, when you ultimately adopt the overlay can be bigger and include contiguous parcels and in stretches of areas. But what qualifies under RENA for vacant or underutilized sites are these sites. But the overlay can cover areas that provide for that opportunity should somebody wants to redevelop. I think Layla mentioned the city of Gardena. That's exactly what the city of Gardena is doing. Their housing overlay is larger than what they need. And the actual properties that we'll be using to meet the RENA are just a subset of those overlay properties. So that's another way to think about it. You can think bigger and more planning with a bigger picture in mind to have an overlay that look at a neighborhood or stretch of corridors or in a more holistic way. But what counts towards the RENA site are these that are considered underutilized at the time that we're doing the site inventory.
And I'd like to add as well in response to a few questions back on can we add more sites to this list? This is a perfect opportunity if you have another site in mind to let us know so that we can do a bit of analysis on it and be sure that it meets the minimum criteria for the state. And then we can add it to the list, just like we did with the 205 Lomita. Like Gina mentioned, it was on the list before the draft site inventory, and we added it back on because it did meet the criteria that we needed. So if you have a site in mind, let Paul know, let us know so we can add it back because we're just kind of at the beginning. This is the first time that you're seeing it in this forum. So I think that's important to note. And also just this does seem, the sites that are selected here do kind of seem sporadic, they're not together, and that's, important. We all realize that for sure. Something that we did during the analysis was look at the proximity to amenities of the city, access to transit, access to public services. And all of these sites are within a quarter mile of those criteria that we were looking for.
Thank you. We're going to go to Chris Pimentel. I'm sorry. Yeah, Chris and then Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I think some of the questions probably betray some of our newness to the minimum standards. I think in a lot of our working groups before this, we probably weren't aware or understand some of the nuance. To be frank, I suspected we would see far more dated properties that are currently have some level of density, whether it's on Imperial or in the first 300 blocks of some of our residential corridor, where you would see a building that has 4 or 6 units, and there would be an opportunity to upscale that and whether add height or density in some manner. So I think that if this is the first run at this, we probably more on the city council end than on the planning commission end would benefit from some education on terminology and environmental requirements. If all of Imperial Avenue, which has the vast majority of our density in the city, if that is not at play in adding affordable units, then I think we have a lot of calculus we need to run through on a city council end. I mean, is that fair to say that all of that, where we have certainly the preponderance of our density, none of that is in play for potentially addressing our HCD requirement, even if it's sound insulated?
So we looked at those sites, and again, what screened them out really was that you ended up netting out so little because you've got such small parcels. You have to do a lot of lot consolidation. And even then you're looking at maybe a net of, 5 units for a block or 10 for a block, where you'd end up needing so much effort to, lot consolidation, raising 20, 30 existing units, and then going through that process only to net a small amount. The sites that were identified originally were not, there was one R3 site, I think it's the Masonic Temple, that ended up being screened out. And then there's I think it's a car wash. And there's another little kind of strip mall retail there that was included originally, but was screened out because of the noise contours. But those sites could be added back in. But yeah, again, the remaining sites are not really going to net for the sake of the sites inventory criteria. It'll be a really hard sell to justify their feasibility for being redeveloped.
Gina,
Thank you.
I can share the map with the noise contour if you'd like. Would that help?
Yeah, just let's look at that quickly, and then we're gonna
Sure.
go to Michelle and then Jay after that.
While we're looking at it, if that noise contour, if there's noise abatement that goes in, does that in any way mitigate the impact of the noise contour? I mean, if we have a settlement agreement that abates that noise.
Right. So like I mentioned, the ALUC, the Airport Land Use Commission, would have to review the housing element, which is fine. We just include that in our process. And then, yes, noise mitigation through looking at the noise impact from the projects, and then noise mitigation to mitigate the noise, and working with the ALUC as well. So that, like Gina mentioned, just a couple of sites in the 70 noise contour.
So Layla, you're saying that even if we looked at that particular contour and we're able to get that variance, for lack of a better word, from LAWA, that there are only 2 sites that are available there?
There's only, Gina, 3 lots, right?
Yeah, 3
Oh, those
parcels.
are the ones you mentioned, the car wash, the strip center next to the car wash, probably Main and Imperial, and one other one.
The Moose Lodge, sorry, gentlemen.
Thank you.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Michelle.
Okay, Mark, you're gonna have to wait. City Attorney Chris did that. You good?
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna go to Ms. Keldorf and then Mr. Heschler and then the City Attorney.
A question. Yep, I had a question on Imperial, and all joking aside, I do think the Moose Lodge would make a nice added site to the list, assuming we could get over the abatement. I know that would not make my husband happy, or maybe some other fine people on this Zoom. And then also the Travel Lodge property on Maple, I believe on Maple, right across from the gas station. Curious if that is a site that would qualify. And then I think just kind of broader stroke, what we just talked about on Imperial Highway and what Councilmember Persick asked about the R3 zone, which was something I think Councilmember Nickel had asked or suggested staff look into, and Planning Commissioner Wingate and I spent a good amount of time with Paul and Greg at the time, and it really underscores what we're talking about. So those lots are zoned at 20, today would be zoned at 27 units to the acre. They're built at a higher density than that currently. And so unless you were going to significantly increase the density, just developers, new owners were not incentivized to do anything different with those properties. And this goes back to just my earlier concern that if we're restricting zoning to a certain standpoint, we might, again, just wind up in the same situation. I understand there's a need to get this in and get HCD to qualify it, but then there's another conversation about how we actually stimulate some of the development that we're looking for in the right places.
Thank you, Mrs. Keldor. All right, we're gonna go to Mr. Heschler and then Mark Hensley.
Yeah, my question is probably for city staff. And the city is undertaking a downtown specific plan update and also the Civic Center redevelopment. And how do those areas factor into any of this thinking? Because if we're talking mixed use on downtown Main Street, which frankly would really benefit from from a little more activity and action, those 2 areas could be really great for studying. So my question would be to either Scott or Paul, where can we look at any of those numbers as affecting our RENA numbers, or is it too preliminary because you're just starting the process?
I think you may have answered the question there, Commissioner. We're starting the process to update the downtown specific plan. So it will take us, about a year and a half to get to the end point where we make decisions on where do we want to make significant changes or rezoning in the downtown. But for the time being, for our purposes today and for the housing element discussion, Our consultant team did investigate, pretty much the entire city, and they did find a couple of lots in the downtown that meet HCD criteria. So that's why they were identified in our list for your consideration tonight. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I guess it's possible to say that even though when our HCD numbers are due in the fall, even though we may not have the downtown specific plan figured out, it's quite likely that we're going to add some density to downtown that will benefit this process.
That is correct. And if, for instance, for some reason later on some of those sites drop off of our list, in the next year or two, we don't make the rezoning, the downtown specific plan could replace other sites that we have in the housing inventory. So that goes to address that issue of no net loss. If you downzone something, then the downtown specific plan could potentially make up for that.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Hensley.
Yes, number of questions been raised about Imperial, and then that would require going through ALEC. And one of the issues, and this is true for all cities, the time frame that HC built into this process was challenging, to say the least, to get the proposed plan to HCD by October and then get it approved within approximately 4 months. There's a hard deadline to that, and to complete the CEQA in that process. From a practical point of view, legally, to add another approval in that process would probably make it impossible to get through in the time frame that HCD gave all the cities. Again, every city's facing it, so I just wanted to address that.
Thanks, Mark. We'll go to Councilmember Perstuck and then Councilmember Drew after that.
Yeah, so 2 points. Given to what they were talking about the downtown, when Ray was Commissioner Ray was talking about, if we know that we are going to be looking at the downtown and the Main Street and potentially rezoning that to allow for residential on the top and commercial on the bottom, why wouldn't we just include that if we're putting the parking lot on the corner of Main and Mariposa? Like, it's more practical to assume that we would allow for residential on top of commercial down Main Street rather than converting that parking lot on Main and Mariposa to have houses. And then my second thing is, back to Melissa Calder's question about the Travelodge. Did we look at that Bank of America there? Because they have quite a large footprint with a large parking area that's really that's underutilized. So I was kind of surprised that parcel of land was not included in this.
Is that the one that's got the grade differential?
Yes, it's I believe it's off of between Sycamore and Walnut at PCH. It's a large footprint that is very underutilized.
If I may start the response to your first point, Councilwoman, about the downtown. The thing is, we don't have enough concrete information about what will happen in the downtown yet. So that's why we're unable to add anything to the housing element today. In other words, we don't know what densities we're going to apply, in areas of the downtown. So that's why it's hard for us to sort of count on that for our housing element today.
But we do know that it's an area that we are looking toward, and we already have an example there with the jewelry source where there's residential on top of the commercial. Yet we, I feel like that area, the parking lot, is just like, it's an open space, so let's pick that. I want to make sure that we're doing this right, and we're looking not just because that it's an open parking lot, so let's take that. That's what that felt like to me. So I'm just kind of concerned, because I do know that we've all talked about the residential, the housing down Main Street on top of commercial. That's my concern.
Understood.
Okay, thank you. We got Councilmember Giroux, and then Layla, do you want to address that first?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond on one of the criteria that we used was that the site was a point that was a half an acre. So all the sites that are on this current list are at least half an acre. So you might see sites that would likely be good to develop, but aren't meeting that half an acre requirement. And also, if we want to preserve parking, that's fine. We just keep that in, that's something that we include in the development standards for the overlay, that existing parking is preserved and we add residential to it and the parking that would be required for the residential.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Giroux.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that what you're suggesting here satisfies the requirements for the HCD. So basically it checks off all the boxes, it gets us where we want to go, and it gets us out of trouble. All right, at least in the short term. I know I'm probably making it a little bit easier than it actually is, but overall, is that kind of what this does? Does this fulfill that?
Yes.
Okay, so based on that, are we married to this once we submit it? Or is it a fluid document that in a couple of years, we start changing zoning, we get different building projects, different things pop up, we can replace that with what you've already submitted?
Yes, HCD's not going to say, well, you said you would develop this site, you have to do it. They just want to ultimately you meet your obligation.
Because I think from what we're talking about here, and that it seems that we're getting in a little bit of the minutia right now of what we like and what we don't like and what we've seen and what we haven't seen. And it seems to me that what your goal is to get us a plan to get us started. Does that make sense?
That's
because
accurate. Yes.
You weren't, obviously everything on that list, we could go through every one of them and call them out. Like, for example, one of them, I think you have 205 Lomita. That's St. Anthony's. It's owned by the Archdiocese. So I don't know what we would do there. But then again, that's not my expertise. So I'm just trying to figure out how to get through what we're doing right now, because we literally could be here for the next week or so talking about every single potential opportunity. Is the goal of today to get us a feasible plan and then work on the details of what we want and what we don't want, because they've given you such a short time frame?
That is the goal.
Why don't we ask Scott?
Why
don't we ask Scott Mitnick or Paul to weigh in? Like, what are the specific outcomes? I understood this was more or less a study session with no directives whatsoever.
Mr. Mayor and members of the council, member of the planning commission, that's correct. Tonight is a study session. Sorry for the choppy nature of how this is playing out, but it's okay because we're getting some good feedback. We're hearing some good sentiment. So this is a study session to make you aware of the challenge. The number's 492. How will we do it? And what I would like to propose that we do as a follow-up as your staff is that we work with many mansion staff and we sort of compartmentalize what I was trying to, when I was asking the consultants earlier. We need to come up with a summary of the existing zoning and existing land use and what the numbers are that could be built based on that. Realizing we're not going to be able to do that, but that's a starting point. The second piece of information or category that we need to come back on is based on these pending applications to do zone changes and other things. If they were to come to fruition, and we're not making any value statement that the planning commission and city council would approve these pending applications, but if they were to come to fruition, what does that do? Then we could look at theoretical opportunities based on stuff we've heard about. We heard about, for example, discussion in the downtown on Main Street, repurposing City Hall. That's on hold right now for a variety of reasons, and we're going to be in front of council probably in August to give an update on that. But if we put it in these categories for you, we can show you where there are opportunities that could happen right away and where there are some challenges. And we're getting some good feedback today about why don't we look at this and look at that. We absolutely should do that. But now I would like, if it's okay with all of you, to sit down, staff to sit down with our consultants and the mini mansions team and say, okay, Now what can we do to go forward and come back and present? We have to be sensitive and mindful of the time constraints on the housing element, but I believe we could do that. Does that make sense? I think that would be more agreeable for all of you. You'd have a better understanding.
Anyone opposed to that, or would people like to continue to deliberate over this? I don't think so. I don't see anyone wanting to. I have one question though, Scott, and this is for the consultants. I haven't seen any discussion, maybe I missed in the staff report, about minimum square footage requirements. In other words, could you build units for individuals as opposed to families of 4 and still meet the RHNA requirements? I'm thinking of military housing, the special needs that you referred to in your housing element. Would that satisfy the requirement? I know there's a big trend moving towards micro studios, 300 square feet, similar to a hotel. You could pack in a lot of density that way, and you could house a lot of high earners and probably even moderate income earners. And does that work? Can you do that, or is there a minimum square footage requirement when you talk about these units, dwelling units per acre? Just a quick question. I'm just wondering.
There is no minimum.
Okay, thank you. That's all I want to know.
Okay.
That's all I want to know. Thank you very much. Okay. All right.
I think
So
your building and general plan are going to have size minimums for building in El Segundo above and beyond whether it's low income.
thanks, Ron. Because the other segue is we as a council, as part of our strategic plan, I think the year before last, said we want to study the R3 and R2 zone, mostly R3, and understand how we can accommodate more housing. So not so much through the RHNA process, which is checking the box, making sure we're compliant, whether or not those overlays actually get taken advantage of through developers is a whole another thing altogether. But how can we provide a catalyst for more density in certain areas for an R3? So I don't think now's the right venue for that. I do think that we are owed an I don't know when that's coming up, Scott, on the agenda to talk about that, but that's definitely a strategic item that we had talked about. So I think that's maybe where people's wires are crossed too. There's two different things going on, it sounds like, right? One is the RHNA, and the other is the city wants to build more housing in R3, or at least study that.
Drew, I agree. And if I could add, I think the conflict we have here is that we've hired some talented consultants to take some state requirements and just apply them to our city. And so when I look at a map that rezones parking and takes away a religious school in town, I know that's not realistic.
Yeah.
But I also agree with you. I think we could do this together. I would like to see what we could do to maximize the R3 zone and encourage development there before we start cannibalizing our parks and cannibalizing things that aren't residential. Because this map, as I see it now, they've taken all the non-residential zones and they want to put overlays on it. So if we do that, what happens 8 years from now when they want another 400 units out of us? We won't have any land left. So I would like to have a conversation about what can we do in the R3 zone as it is to boost it and maximize it before we start taking other properties that aren't residential right now.
That housing assessment is going on right now. By the way, that R3 assessment and R2 assessment, we think that's due in, I believe, August or September. We should see that come through.
That's correct. Council members, commissioners, there's the R3 study in the Washington area and beyond. So that is pending.
Good stuff. So I think it was a little bit of a choppy start, Scott, to use your phrase, but all really good information. And I think, typically we start meetings like, what's the end in mind? What are we looking to achieve? And we didn't do that in this situation, but it was a study session. Does anyone have any further comments? Jay, I see your hand up. Jay, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I do, please. I'm glad the city took the time to do a survey of residents. And one of the questions they asked was, please rank from 1 to 5, with 1 being your first choice, in what area of El Segundo should new housing be built? Well, the number 1 answer, kind of by a long shot, was east of Sepulveda, east of PCH. And I realize none of that area has been studied or has been recommended. And I guess I'm just curious to know, where does that fit into this conversation?
It doesn't. We're not relitigating it. We voted on it 2 years ago. Done.
Well, let's let Scott Mitnick weigh in on that one. Scott, what's your, thank you, Mayor.
Mr. Mayor, members of the Council Planning Commission, the presentation stopped before we got into the survey data, and we could spend a few minutes going through that data With a caveat, I want to make it clear, when the survey was done, it was done with the intention of protecting the integrity of the R1 zoning as it is. So the question was not asked, are you comfortable with more infill development within the R1 zoning to make it higher density? So then it looked at, here's some other options, what do you think? It doesn't mean that the community is saying we want to do this. It's just saying we have to produce more units. You're going to go outside the R1 zone. What are you comfortable with? So Mr. Mayor and Mr. Planning Commissioner Chair, if you're comfortable, we could go through the survey data, but just know, keep in mind the context in which those questions were asked.
I don't know that we all got that information. Does anyone feel like they want to go through it on this call? I don't think so. I think we're good. But Jay, thank you for adding that context. Much appreciated.
Could I ask quickly for those watching at home, is there an email if they have comments now that they've seen this presentation and they didn't make a public communication? Can we provide an email so that we can collect that data from our constituents here?
Point.
They could send it to Paul Samaras.
Yeah.
Can we put that on the screen somehow, or just call or email Paul Samaras?
PSAMARAS@elsegundo.org.
Thank you.
And for those that don't have a pen or pencil, just call the city clerk and ask. And we're going to follow up with the 6 people that either sent emails in or spoke. We will follow up with them personally.
Scott, can you talk about next step as we wind this down?
Paul, you have a slide. There they are. So, Paul, you want to walk through these steps with the key getting to the end of this calendar year to get our proposal in front of HCD. So, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, if I may. One thing is critical for us to make progress on our sort of timeline here. So we have to have a site inventory decided on. So we will go back and do some more thinking and present to you kind of an updated list or some more options as soon as possible. But in order to make good progress on our environmental review for this, we do have to have that site inventory prepared. So we don't have a consensus here on what staff presented to you tonight, but we'll work on that. So that'll take us some time, but we'll come back to you, finalize the site inventory, get your okay on that. And then we'll finish drafting, putting together a draft housing element. And that will be taken to the Planning Commission. So this timeline on your screen is probably not reflective of exactly what we're going to do. We're probably going to end up to the Planning Commission a little bit later than August. But then we can still manage to get to City Council hearing at the end of the year or early next year, so we can actually submit our adopted housing element to HCD in February next year. So that's just a brief summary. So number one, we will do our best to come back to you quickly with sites inventory so we can get an okay from the group, and we'll proceed from there.
Thank you, Paul. I just got City Clerk brought up a great point, which is similar to what Jay brought up, that some of the public viewing may want to actually see the survey data. I mean, they could get it off our website, but since we're on now, can you go just do a quick run through of what the survey results were during this meeting?
Yeah, I will let Layla run through that for us. Go ahead, Layla, take it away.
I think this is the last slide. Yes, thank you. I'm Layla Carver from CSG, and this slide that we have up here is just the community outreach efforts that have happened so far. On April 13th, we had a community workshop, and of course, the city webpage has we have a housing element update webpage on the city website. We also did a survey. The city did a survey using a tool called Mentimeter online. And the city also has a YouTube video that you may have watched. And of course, there was outreach on all the city's official social media, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we sent postcards out to let the agencies, local businesses, nonprofits, and religious institutions, religious facilities know about the housing element update. And the meetings, all the meetings, including the workshop in April, were noticed in the El Segundo Herald on April 8th, May 13th, and June 10th. And like I mentioned, one of the outreach efforts we did was conduct a community survey, and that's only one source of input. We received over 1,100 survey participants that took the survey between April 1st and May 17th. And of course, the survey was very broad, so just there may be a follow-up with another more defined survey. And now, of course, the results of the survey, one of the questions that the city asked is, what 3 words would you use to describe El Segundo? And of course, some of the top words that many people use, so the larger the word on the screen, the more frequent that word was used by survey participants. So safe, friendly, community, and neighborly. Then the words get smaller from there. Another question we ask, please rank from 1 to 5, with 1 being your first choice. In what area of El Segundo should new housing be built? And the top priority, as is shown here, was east of PCH at about 26%, and Smoky Hollow area at about 23%, and at a tie for this the city, about 19% for both of these areas along PCH and also on Imperial Avenue. And another question that we asked, please rank from 1 to 6, with 1 being your first choice. What type of housing you feel is most needed in El Segundo? And the top priority based on the survey results are about 22% housing that is affordable to public service workers such as teachers. And the second is at about 19% housing that is affordable to professionals working in aerospace, high tech, etc. And tied for about 16% is single family housing for double income families, and also at 16% multifamily housing. And then both tied at about 13% housing that is affordable for service workers who work in retail sales, restaurants, hotels, etc. And also at 13% small studio type units to affordably accommodate singles or couples. Another question that we asked is, which of these items would you rank as the highest priority when it comes to housing developments? And the highest rank is 46% at just proximity to amenities such as grocery stores, schools, religious facilities, etc. And at 32%, the second highest ranking is on-site amenities, parking, benches, bike paths. Another question we asked, in your opinion, what housing types would you like to see more of in El Segundo? And the highest so the question was select the top 3. So the top 3, the first at 28%, repurposing of office and commercial sites to accommodate mixed use. At 22%, repurposing of office and commercial to accommodate residential uses. And then about 20% at workforce housing in the Smoky Hollow area. And the next question, on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being very important, how important are the following concerns to you? And the sliding scale is between not important and important. And the highest out of the choices here are maintaining the existing character of the residential and commercial districts of the city, And the second is ensuring the housing market in El Segundo provides a diverse range of housing types to meet the varied needs of local residents. And third, providing housing for residents with special needs, such as housing for seniors, large families, veterans, and/or persons with disabilities. And I believe the last question in the survey, these are existing housing goals adopted in the current housing element, the housing element that we currently have adopted. How applicable are these goals to El Segundo today and for the future? And again, the scaling is between very applicable and not applicable for today. And top is conserving and improving the existing condition of affordable housing stock, and tied at about the same at 2.7, assisting in development of affordable housing and providing adequate sites to achieve a diversity of housing. And that was the questions from the survey. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And I put the slide back up here for
Oh, beautiful. Yep. I think we should close on that. Maybe the El Segundo TV or whoever is running the Zoom could just have that stay up while we close the meeting out. Are there any final comments from staff or, yeah, Mr. Minnick?
Mr. Mayor, members of the Council of Planning Commission, just a clarification. Comment was made about making affordable housing available for certain groups, such as teachers and that type of thing. As much as cities would like to do that, we are prohibited from doing that. So I just wanted to point out, we can't designate certain groups. We can designate incomes and other categories as allowed by federal or state law, but we can't do it by occupations or certain types. So I just, I was asked to point that out. I just want to make sure everybody understands that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Minnick. Just to belabor that a little bit longer. So we couldn't have veteran housing as a project that would qualify for the affordability?
Actually, veterans are recognized under federal laws to give them.
What about active military, Mark? Would that count as well?
Yes. There.
Thank you.
Yeah, we did have a speaker early on asked about that. We'll follow up. Some categories we can, but the general, many of the ones we heard about, we're not able to. And also, we can't just, you can't say only for El Segundo residents or residents of the South Bay. You have to be very careful about that as well.
Okay. I think that concludes our meeting, our study session, right? Mr. Mitnick, do you feel good about it? City Clerk, Tracy Weaver, all good?
You're good, we're good. Again, I want to apologize. I do want to apologize to the 5 council members and the 5 commissioners. It was a little bit sloppy and choppy. However, it's good to have this type of discussion. We took copious notes, great feedback. We will follow up accordingly. And we look forward to working with Many Mansions and our consultants and come back with a little more comprehensive approach. And by those different categories I talked about. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're adjourned at 6:09 p.m. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.